Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be showing you this Crazy Cat Halloween card using Tim Holtz stamps, distress inks and Gansai Tambi watercolours. So to start this card I'm going to begin with some Tim Holtz watercolour cardstock, and I'm going to be using the Tim Holtz Crazy Cat stamp set 2. I'm going to be using the one on the top left. This is a really quirky and fun stamp set to work with. And the other stamp set that I'm going to be using is the Crazy Birds Mini with accessories. So I'm going to be using the witch's hat, the witch's broom and the little pumpkin lantern. The first thing I'm going to need to do is to trim down this cardstock because it's slightly bigger than my A6 card base. So I'm just going to trim that down slightly to make sure that the images are in the centre of the page when I come to stamp it out. I'm just making sure it fits on my card base. I'm then going to be bringing out my Misty stamp tool, which I absolutely adore. It makes stamping so much easier. I'm going to turn it around so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to put my cardstock in the Misty and secure it down with the 2 magnets so that it doesn't move when I come to stamp the image onto it. Before I started this card I had a rough idea what I wanted to do, but I wasn't entirely sure of the layout. So before I start stamping, I bring out all the images and place them onto the page, and then I arrange them as to what I think will look best. I do tend to have a play around, move things around, make sure I like the look of what I'm doing before I stamp it onto the cardstock. So here you're just seeing me kind of shifting things around, deciding where I want things to go. And for this one I'm going to do a little bit of masking because I want the cat to have the witch's hat on. And the important thing to start with is the image that you want on the top. So with this hat it's going to be over the cat, so I'm going to stamp that first with some Ranger Archival black ink and then press that down onto the watercolour cardstock. The good thing with the Misty is that if it doesn't stamp you can just stamp it again in the same place. And then I'm going to add some post-it note tape over the top and use the leftover ink that's on the stamp to create a secondary impression. I can then cut that out with my scissors to create a mask, which I'll put on the page before stamping the cat. So I just don't want the ears to go over the base of the hat, so I don't need to cut the whole image out. I'll only cut what I need, just to make it easier and quicker. And the good thing with this post-it note tape is it's not super sticky, so it will stick to the page but it's not going to tear what's underneath. So you can see then I'm going to position that into place and make sure it's stuck down firmly, and then position where I think the cat needs to sit. The problem I find with these stamps is they're not the clear stamps, so it's harder to see where I'm going to be putting the image onto the page. One of the things I like to do is put a piece of acetate down first and then stamp on the top of it to make sure that where my stamp is in the best position. Now the good thing with the archival ink is when it's stamped onto the acetate it can just be wiped off with a baby wipe later, but it's just good that I can see before I stamp it permanently onto the page where it's going to be. So with this one I needed to move the paper down slightly so that the cat was going to be in the right area. So and now I have that all in position, I'm just doing a final check to make sure everything's lined up correctly, and then I'm going to ink that up with the archival ink. This is good for using with watercolours, which we'll be doing slightly later. It's not going to bleed when I add water. So I'm just pressing that down to make sure I get a crisp image of the cat. And then when I move that mask you'll then see that the top of the cat's head won't have stamped and the hat will be sitting on the top instead. And then I'm just adding the accessories in at the bottom as to where I thought they looked best, and then inking them up with the archival ink as well before we start to watercolour. To clean these stamps off I use exactly the same method as my clear cling stamps. So I just take a baby wipe and run that over the surface to take off that excess ink and then dry it off with a kitchen towel. For the watercolouring part today, I'm going to be using the Kooky Gansai Tambi watercolours. These were a gift for my birthday this year. They come from Japan, and I know a lot of the crafties are big on these watercolours at the moment. They are really good watercolours. They're really pigmented as well, so you get some brilliant colours. For the witch's hat, I'm going to use the darkest purple in this set. It's slightly out of frame here, so you can't see it. But all I'm doing to activate those pans of colour is squeezing my water brush slightly to get a droplet into the pan. And then it's going to allow me to pick up some of that colour. So I started off with a light base, and then I'm just adding darker, more bits of colour into where I think the darker spaces need to be. I'm going to put a list of the colours on the screen so you can see which colours I'm using for this image, and I'm going to switch the music on and let you sit back and enjoy me paint this image, and I'll come back to you once I've finished. So once the image is finished, this is what it looks like. I'm just going to quickly dry it with my heat tool so that I can move on to doing the watercolour background. Now for the background, I'm going to use some distress inks. So what I like to do with this is have a piece of white card and some acetate, and then push the ink onto the acetate, which I can then pick up with a normal paintbrush. So I'm using shabby shutters and peeled paint for this, and I'm just going to put some of that ink down and get my paintbrush and water jar ready. I'm then going to wet the background with plain water. I normally put quite a lot of water down because I want that paint to spread. All I'm going to do is touch the paint to that water and let it bleed into its own shape. So I'm just going to pick up some of that ink with my paintbrush and water and drop it into the water that's on the page, and as you see, it spreads and bleeds and forms its own organic kind of shape. So I'm just going to dab that around. I do sometimes push it around to where I want it to go, but most of the time I'll just drop it into that water, and then I'm adding some more plain water on the opposite side and doing the exact same thing. The first colour that I've put down is the shabby shutters, and then I will add some of the peeled paint on top. These dry quite a bit lighter than how it goes on wet, so that's something to bear in mind when you're first putting these colours onto your page. And then I'm going to add some water and pick up some bundled sage and start to add that in. It does look quite dark, but it does dry a lot lighter. I'm also not going to dry the paint in between the layers. I'm just going to add this straight on top of the shabby shutters so that it blends and bleeds together and forms a really nice grungy look. If you get areas like I do in a moment where I put the ink down and it doesn't move and bleed, I pick up some extra water and then just blend that out myself. If the more water you add to it, it spreads itself, so all you need to do is add a bit more plain water in. Once I've added all the colours in, I decided I wanted some of that bundled sage splattered across the page, so I just went in with a bit more water and picked up some of that ink and flicked it over the page. Once this bit is done, I'm then going to add my heat tool to the image just to dry it off slightly between the different layers. And I'm also picking the page up and heating it from the back, because with it being watercolour it does sometimes warp, and this just helps flatten it out slightly. I am going to be adhering it down with foam tape anyway to keep it a bit flatter at the end of the card. Then I decided I wanted more of those splatters to add to the grungy feel, so I picked up some more of that bundled sage and flicked it across the page. Once I've done that, again I'll dry it to make sure that it's not going to move around. To clean off the acetate with the distress inks, all I use is a baby wipe and then a piece of kitchen towel. It's easy to clean off, and then I can put it away and use it next time I use my distress inks. One of the effects of the distress inks that I like is the bleaching effect. So I add some droplets into my hand and shake it over the page before picking it up with a paper towel. Thanks to Christina Warner for the handy tip of putting the water in your hand and then sprinkling it. You get some bigger droplets, which works better. I added some more in afterwards as well, just to get some more of that distressed, bleachy, grungy feel. I leave it for a couple of minutes and then pick it up with the towel, and as you'll see, it just lightens up some of that area and creates a bleaching effect on the page. I then line it up with my card base to see if I wanted to have a background or not. I actually decided I thought it was a bit too plain and wanted a very small black border before adhering it to the card base. I used the new My Favourite Things Frightful Friends stamp set for adding some bats. I wanted to add a few in because I love bats, so why not? seemed like a fun thing to do. I used the black archival ink again so it matches the rest of the image. So I'm just going to pop these down, and I'm just going to use my stamp block to stamp these down. I do end up stamping 4, but I hide one of them at the top. I wasn't too sure it looked right at the end, but you'll see what I do to fix that. It's always good to show some mistakes or things that you're not quite sure of, and then end up with a card that you really like at the end. So I'm just going to stamp these in before moving on to the next section. So once I've finished stamping the bats, I'm then going to line this up against the black cardstock. I'm just getting a feel for what kind of background line I want around the edge, and then I'm going to trim it with my Fiskars paper trimmer. One of the things that I like to do is place it while I'm trimming it so that I can make sure the edge is even all the way around, and then it saves me faffing about, keep trying to cut it down or going too small and then having to recut another size once I've done that. So this way I just make sure I get an even edge on all 4 sides. Then I'm going to adhere it down with some of the 3mm Scotch foam tape. As I explained in my last video, this stuff I absolutely love, but it's a pain to try and get here in the UK. But I use a lot on the back of watercolour panels just to make sure it stays flat, especially when you're sending it in the mail. It doesn't squash the card. So I'm just going to peel that backing off and adhere it to the black back panel. Once the black panel's adhered, I'll then use my ATG tape runner to add some more adhesive. It's really strong adhesive, so you don't need too much, onto the back of that panel and adhere it to my card base. This is an A6 craft card base, and they're pre-made cards by Paper Mania, so they're easy just to score down the middle and hey presto, a pre-made card. I'm going to use some of that extra black cardstock to create a banner for the sentiment, and I'll be using the Happy Halloween from My Favourite Things Spooky Sweets stamp set. So I'm going to emboss this with some of the Paper Mania copper embossing powder, and I'm just going to use my anti-static tool over that black piece of cardstock to make sure it doesn't stick anywhere I don't want it to. So I'm going to stamp it using the Versamark embossing ink, which I love. It's really sticky and it just tends to work better, in my opinion, with embossing powders, especially fine ones. I use my grid mat just to line this up so that I can get a straight stamp impression. I can then sprinkle over that embossing powder with my little spoon to make sure it covers that ink, and then I just tap it off to make sure all the excess comes off. You can then use your heat tool. Make sure it's fairly hot when you come to do this so it doesn't warp the paper very much. I think I needed to let mine heat up a little bit more, but as you can see, once it starts to melt, it turns that powder into a really nice metallic copper. I then need to trim this down to make sure that it fits on the card. So again, I'm just going to use my Fiskars paper trimmer to make sure that I get some nice clean edges. I decided I wanted to make this banner into a fishtail banner, so I'm just going to trim off some of that end piece, and then I'll cut it straight down the middle before cutting it diagonal to the centre point of that middle cut. And as you'll see, it creates a nice little end of a banner, so it's not just a rectangular box. And then I'm going to stick this to the base of my card using some more of that Scotch foam tape. To finish up the card, I'm going to use some Ranger's glossy accents on the cat eyes just to add that shine and dimension. It just adds a bit more interest to the card. I do love using glossy accents as much as possible, and in this fine tip nozzle bottle it makes it a lot easier to have that extra control. For the witch's hat, I'm going to add some Clear Wink of Stella. If you haven't used this before, it's like a shimmery glittery pen, and it's water based, so it does react with watercolours, so I only add a very light shimmer over this because I don't want to take up that watercolour paint that I've done already. You can't quite see how sparkly it actually is. It does show up a little bit on the camera, but not as much as it does close up. To finish this off, I'm just going to go over some of the black images and lines on the card with my Jelly Roll pen to make sure some of those lines stand out. They got a bit lost with the watercolour or didn't stamp very well, so just by going over this with the black gel pen just brings them back out. And then the last thing I'll do is use the white Jelly Roll pen to add highlights to the image. That completes the card for this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.